Since September 11, 2001, American soldiers have been fighting a new battle in a new war, the war on terror. Like all wars, though, it takes a combination of technology, equipment, and training to take the fight to the enemy. Technology, training, and equipment that you will see here in these highly acclaimed documentaries that have thrilled audiences all over the world. Over the years, these award-winning programs have revealed the countless untold stories of bravery and compassion that are symbolic of America's soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, firefighters, and first responders. These are powerful stories of initiative under fire, of technology advancing combat capabilities, of fear and courage, and the incredible emotions that underpin the life of our frontline forces. We are proud to present these original, digitally enhanced programs so that we will never forget the courage of those willing to put their own lives on the line to save ours. So, watch closely. There are no do-overs in combat and no retakes in combat photography. What you are about to see are truly one-of-a-kind, never-to-be filmed-again scenes of military action that are riveting, up close, and unretouched. They are as relevant today as the day they were filmed. These are the untold stories of the challenge of flight.
Fighter craft demonstrate combat tactics. Fighter pilots on the move to intercept the bombers. And any one of 10,000 civilian watchers can start this efficient defense machine.
From Fort Douglas, Utah to Seattle, the 7th Bombardment Group puts on a special demonstration of sky power.
And that takes more skill than high flying. At the Texas Flying Field, Army aviators give a thrilling demonstration.
With the President's plea spurring the aviation industry, the Lockheed plant goes all out in production of Hudson bombers for the RAF. To the line into cockpits for their first use of the airplane as a military instrument.
Test pilot Bob Purcell is going aloft in a Curtiss P-40 Standard Army pursuit ship for a crack at the speed record. And, brother, he does, and how? Planes like these, with their long range and striking power, are going to England. These are for Uncle Sam and America's defense.
War is an infinite expanse of horror. And no one knows that better than the crew of a battle-damaged bomber or lone fighter struggling to make it home. Riddled with bullets, engines out or on fire, injured or dying men on board, pilots facing this heroic challenge often beat the odds with nothing more than willpower. When they do, they are more than heroes. This is their story, limping home on a wing and a prayer. Tens of thousands of aircraft and airmen were pressed into service to fight World War II. Day in and day out, missions would be planned, pilots would be briefed, and crews would climb into their planes for yet another run, each knowing full well that any mission could be their last. For most, it would be a long, cold, tense day of flying, filled with brief moments of terror. But they would make it back alive. For others, the unlucky few, the final moments of flight would come no more than seconds into a mission, oftentimes during takeoff, worse, with a full load of bombs. The stories of heroics are particularly poignant. Coming off the target, Lieutenant Lawley's B-17 was attacked by approximately 20 enemy fighters, shot out of formation, and severely crippled. 8 crew members were wounded. The co-pilot was killed by a 20-millimeter shell. 1 engine was on fire. The controls shot away. First Lieutenant Lawley seriously and painfully wounded about the face. Forcing the co-pilot's body off the controls, he brought the plane out of a steep dive, flying with his left hand only. Blood covered the instruments and windshield, and visibility was impossible. With a full bomb load, the plane was difficult to maneuver. The bombs could not be released because the racks were frozen. After the order to bail out had been given, one of the waist gunners informed the pilot that 2 crew members were so severely wounded that it would be impossible for them to bail out. With the fire in the engine spreading, the danger of an explosion was imminent. Because of the helpless condition of his wounded crew members, First Lieutenant Lawley elected to remain with the ship and bring them to safety, if it was humanly possible. Enemy fighters again attacked, but by using masterful evasive action, he managed to lose them. 1 engine again caught on fire and was extinguished by skillful flying. First Lieutenant Lawley remained at his post, refusing first aid until he collapsed from sheer exhaustion, caused by the loss of blood, shot, and the energy he had expended in keeping control of his plane. He was revived by the bombardier and again took over the controls. Coming over the English coast, 1 engine ran out of gasoline and had to be feathered. Another engine started to burn and continued to do so until, on a small fighter base, a successful crash landing was made. There were no easy missions, and it never seemed to be over until it was over. The enemy did everything they could to blow a bomber out of the sky, if they had to, even pressing the attack across the channel and over the airfield as a bomber lined up to land. The war was horrible, and no crew was ever safe until they got home, got out of the aircraft, and the mission was in the history books. On many occasions, pilots brought back aircraft stricken with mechanical problems. Bad problems, of course, but without the added concern of unknown battle damage. This A-20 executes a perfect gear-up landing, choosing the dirt to minimize sparking. Pilots won't leave fellow pilots alone and exposed to the enemy, not if they can help it. On air rescue alert in the vicinity of the WWII Islands, Lieutenant Gordon unhesitatingly responded to a report of a crash and flew boldly into a harbor, defying close-range fire from enemy shore guns, to make 3 separate landings in full view of the Japanese and pick up 9 men, several of them injured. With his cumbersome flying boat dangerously overloaded, he made a brilliant takeoff despite heavy swells and almost total absence of wind, and set a course for base, only to receive the report of another group stranded in a rubber life raft 600 yards from the enemy shore. Promptly turning back, he again risked his life to set his plane down under direct fire of the heaviest defenses of Cavite and take aboard 6 more survivors, coolly making his 4th dexterous takeoff with 15 rescued officers and men. By his exceptional daring, personal valor, and incomparable airmanship under most perilous conditions, Lieutenant Gordon prevented certain death or capture of our airmen by the Japanese. A gear-up landing is actually more complex than it seems. Of foremost concern to the pilot is how the gear is configured. Are both mains up? Is one up and the other down? By far the worst configuration to deal with. Or is the nose gear gone, but both mains are down? Every aircraft has standard operating procedures for these configurations, and in some cases, the best procedure is to just bail out. Usually, though, any landing is better than a sit. This B-24 is setting up a difficult gear-up landing. The Liberator stands well above the ground. Landing without the nose gear carries with it the extra risk of flipping the plane if the nose stubs into the ground. The pilot, however, executes a perfect two-point landing. Battle damage is a deceptive thing indeed, no question. This airframe is riddled with bullet holes, and yet it somehow looks far less dramatic than it should. Little puncture holes, small tears in the metal, a few here and there. Deceptive it is, but terrifying when you're in the air with slugs slamming into the cabin, any and all capable of blowing through a fuel line, striking a bomb, or killing you on the spot. Good procedure in a gear-up landing is to kill the engine, cut the electrical and ignition sources that could trigger a fire. In a true gear-up, once the landing starts, the pilot is essentially along for the ride, hopeful that wind won't catch under a wing or that some other force won't cause the aircraft to flip. Fighters are built to be agile, but they're also built to be tough, something one comes to fully realize when the durability of the airframe is the margin that gets you home. It's a naturally curious thing to see a P-40 Warhawk half burrowed into the ground following a belly landing. This B-29 is enveloped in flames only moments after coming to a stop. Thankfully, the crew scrambles to safety, although it was a very close call. Hung bombs, particularly incendiary, which were commonly carried in the Pacific, are a terrible risk during a gear-up landing. In the distant background, a drama of another sort is played out. So very, very close to home, a B-29 pitches out of control and tumbles into the ground, with loss of all on board. Hit first, hit hard, and never stop. Consistently outnumbered throughout successive hazardous flights over heavily defended hostile territory, Major Boynton struck at the enemy with daring and courageous persistence, leading his squadron into combat with devastating results to Japanese shipping, shore installations, and aerial forces. Resolute in his efforts to inflict crippling damage on the enemy, Major Boynton led a formation of 24 fighters over Kahili on 17 October, and persistently circling the airdrome where 60 hostile aircraft were grounded, boldly challenged the Japanese to send up planes. Under his brilliant command, our fighters shot down 20 enemy craft in the ensuing action without the loss of a single ship. A superb airman and determined fighter against overwhelming odds, Major Boynton personally destroyed 26 of the many Japanese planes shot down by his squadron, and by his forceful leadership developed the combat readiness in his command, which was a distinctive factor in the Allied aerial achievements in this vitally strategic area. As common as it seems today, strafing ground targets was an innovation, not a fait accompli, during World War II. In the early years of the war, pilots coming home understandably stayed high, But as the war progressed, they requested and received permission to drop down and hunt their way back. Anything with remote military value was fair game. Film footage from gun cameras are dramatic and show the deadly power of cannon fire. The tracers that look like return fire are for the most part ricochets. In the Pacific, the B-25 flew high-speed, low-level bomb runs and used skip bombing to more effectively attack Japanese ships. The bomb, impacting the water with maximum forward motion, would skip across the water and strike a ship above the waterline, where the hull was more vulnerable. While effective, this practice placed the B-25 crews at great risk, exposing them to withering anti-aircraft fire. The Mitchell was a sturdy aircraft, and her durable construction saved many an aircrew, not only in the air, but during the long ride home damaged from enemy fire. In these sequences, a low-level attack is being made on a Japanese airfield. Pilots loved their nose-mounted 75s, and the punch it packed was absolutely feared in the Pacific. Down low on the deck, the Mitchells would come up on you with no notice, sweep the airfield, and get out. Thankfully, the Raiders return home safely, and their silhouettes are a welcome sight indeed. But at the end, a lone B-25 flares into a brutally hard gear-up landing. The crew is safe, there is no fire, but the bomber is headed for the scrap heap. Ironically, one of the best places for a difficult landing is the last place most would think of, the aircraft carrier. In fact, on a carrier, everything a crippled aircraft needs is just a few feet away. Plus, with the cable, there's no risk of losing control during the rollout. Further, if all else fails, the barrier will trip you up. Either way, you're home. Notice how quickly this aircraft is surrounded by crewmen. Medics, fire crews, crash trucks, maintenance, and plenty of able-bodied seamen surround you. What takes precious minutes on land is there for you in an instant at sea. From the very first days of carrier aviation, designers had to concern themselves with stopping the airplane. It was assumed that pilots would make high approaches, float down the deck, hold off too long, bounce or dive for the deck. Just about anything and everything. But no matter what the problem, they had to be stopped. To do that, as many as 12 wires stretched across the approach end of the deck to arrest arriving aircraft. And if that wasn't enough, a bank of barriers were elevated high enough to snag the plane that got through the first straps. While effective and better than a crash, the barrier itself is risky, and pilots have been crushed when their planes flipped over, as often happens. The real risk of landing is missing the deck or the wires entirely. Ramp strikes and smashing into the island happens even to this day, and none of them are good. Nonetheless, the carrier remains a Navy pilot's first choice, limping home or not, peace or war. Photographers have always been a part of naval aviation safety, which is why this extraordinary footage exists. In some form or the other, almost every carrier landing has been recorded on film or tape. And good landing or bad, watching these tapes helps improve skills throughout the Navy. There's always more to combat aviation than just flying. And in rising to the challenge, pilots will forget that they're mortal and their aircraft mere machines. In a daring flight to intercept a wave of 150 Japanese planes, First Lieutenant Sweat hurled his 4-plane division into action against a formation of 15 enemy bombers, and during his dive, personally exploded 3 hostile planes in mid-air with accurate and deadly fire. Although separated from his division while clearing the heavy concentration of anti-aircraft fire, he boldly attacked 6 enemy bombers, engaged the first 4 in turn, and unaided shot them down in flames. Exhausting his ammunition as he closed on the 5th Japanese bomber, he relentlessly drove his attack against terrific opposition, which partially disabled his engine, shattered the windscreen, and sliced his face. In spite of this, he brought his battered plane down with skillful precision in the water off the line without further injury. Ditching an aircraft into the sea is not necessarily a good way to get back home, but it's often the best of a lot of bad options. The trade-offs are these. There's almost no chance of a post-crash fire, and that's a big plus with hung bombs. But there's the new risk of sinking. While water would seem to be softer than land, and it is if you hit it right. If not, it's just another crash. Finally, deceleration forces are far more violent when you ditch than in an ordinary landing. The enemy is relentless too. The group in which First Lieutenant Michael was flying was attacked by a swarm of fighters. His plane was singled out, and the enemy pressed their attacks home recklessly, completely disregarding the Allied fighter escort and their own intense flak. His plane was riddled from nose to tail with exploding cannon shells and knocked out of formation, with a large number of enemy following it down, blasting it with cannon fire as it descended. A cannon shell exploded in the cockpit, wounded the co-pilot, wrecked the instruments, and blew out the side window. First Lieutenant Michael was seriously and painfully wounded in the right thigh. Hydraulic fluid filmed over the windshield, making visibility impossible, and smoke filled the cockpit. The controls failed to respond, and 3,000 feet were lost before he succeeded in leveling off. The radio operator informed him that the whole bomb bay was in flames as a result of the explosion of 3 cannon shells which had ignited the incendiaries. With a full load of incendiaries in the bomb bay and a considerable gas load in the tanks, the danger of fire enveloping the plane and the tanks exploding seemed imminent. When the emergency release lever failed to function, First Lieutenant Michael at once gave the order to bail out, and 7 of the crew left the plane. Seeing the bombardier firing the navigator's gun at enemy planes, First Lieutenant Michael ordered him to bail out, as the plane was liable to explode any minute. When the bombardier looked for his parachute, he found that it had been riddled with 20-millimeter fragments and was useless. First Lieutenant Michael, seeing the ruined parachute, realized that if the plane was abandoned, the bombardier would perish, and decided that the only chance would be a crash landing. Completely disregarding his own painful and profusely bleeding wounds, but thinking only of the safety of the remaining crew members, he gallantly evaded the enemy, using violent evasive action despite the battered condition of his plane. After the plane had been under sustained enemy attack for fully 45 minutes, First Lieutenant Michael finally lost the persistent fighters in a cloud bank. Upon emerging, an accurate barrage of flak caused him to come down to treetop level, where flak towers poured a continuous rain of fire on the plane. He continued into France, realizing that any moment a crash landing might have to be attempted, but trying to get as far as possible to increase the escape possibilities if a safe landing could be achieved. First Lieutenant Michael flew the plane until he became exhausted from the loss of blood, which had formed on the floor in pools, and he lost consciousness. The co-pilot succeeded in reaching England and sighted an RAF field near the coast. First Lieutenant Michael finally regained consciousness and insisted upon taking over the controls to land the plane. The undercarriage was useless. The bomb bay doors were jammed open. The hydraulic system and altimeter were shot out. In addition, there was no airspeed indicator. The ball turn was jammed with the guns pointing downward, and the flaps would not respond. Despite these apparently insurmountable obstacles, he landed the plane without mishap. Stories of heroism stand as monuments to courage and duty, and for aviators, these stories set the standard for today, for yesterday, and for generations to come. Lest we ever watch a B-17 or P-51 fly without remembering our heroes, lest we ever forget those who placed the precious lives of another human above their own, lest we ever forget.